Today are left in. Okay, thank you. Mega herbivores have been left to this crumbled wilderness, largely in the global south, and that is something fascinating for me because when we imagine large animals and humans, we would imagine that with increasing human population, they would decline, and we know that extinction. For an example, the first graph is from IBIS. We see that increasing extinction of species with increasing human population globally, and it matches closely with the great acceleration during 1950s. But when we say geographically, it is not the same story. The second graph here shows population on x-axis, of course, and carnivore population on y-axis. There is a sharp exponential decline of carnivore population with increasing human population, but we have a fascinating outlier there in South Asia. One is India and another Nepal, where we have this co-occurrence of densely packed humans and large carnivores, including tigers. And that becomes more interesting. The story becomes more fascinating, I think, interesting, I think, when seen from a socio-ecological perspective, imagining that this landscape has been one of the most historically altered landscape in modern times. It is emerging into it has become the most populous area in the world with underlying prevalent poverty, increasing climatic risks, and inequity, prevalent inequity across the spectrum, and that elsewhere can be linked with extinctions of large animals, but not here. And why would that be the reason? And what are the reasons is something that we'll talk about. And these reasons becomes more important, more relevant when we see the trajectory of this region. It has witnessed some of the sharpest increase in development indices in the recent past, and it is expected to increase on these trends. And yet it supports some magnificent megafauna, including these species about which we are going to talk today. Of course, there are 4 megaherbivore species, tiger and the snow leopard. And I've been very lucky to say that I'm very privileged to have worked with amazing people who enabled this work and who guided me, who came along and helped me, amazing institutions, including the government institutions like the Wildlife Institute or the National Tiger Conservation Authority, many civil bodies and people who came together to develop this work. The first part of the story comes from the tiger recovery, which has become almost emblematic to India's conservation scenarios. An example, tigers have been revered in South Asian cultures historically for a very long time. Yes, we all know that. Hunting was always prevalent, but the methods of hunting differed with times, right? In the early medieval era, hunting was mostly done by lesser sophisticated instruments, which ensured that the persecution rates were not exceeding the regeneration rate of these species. And as a result of it, by 1840s, there is an estimate of 100,000 tigers left in the Indian subcontinent. But this sharply declined in 60 to 70 years, where by 1940s, nearly 80,000 tigers were killed. And that is because, of course, the sophisticated tools used for hunting and this exploitation of shikar hunting by the colonial era, where the shikar or the hunting led to mass extinctions of tigers from many parts. And this regime of hunting continued even after India's independence from 1947 onwards, because the policies were as they were adapted in the independent state. And government initially promoted tiger hunting because it saw it as a source of economy and to deal with poverty, of course. But something interesting was also happening during this time. The East Asian countries were getting richer. And when you become rich, wealthy, what you do is you show off the wealth, right? I mean, not everyone, but that's the attitude, at least when it came to the fashion industry in the East, on using tiger skins and body parts for popularity. And that is when things changed in 1970s. The then Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, led development of this of a legal instrument called as Wildlife Protection Act, which had this carpet ban on hunting of scheduled species. I mean, it's a category of species, including the tigers. And that turned the tide to speak very plainly. But of course, legislation without action, they're just words. So what happened following this legislation was there were key bureaucratic development, including assessment of population of tiger, investments on averting poaching, and including communities for stopping the exploitation of wildlife. And that continued, but the methods that were initially used were based on pug marks. They were not foolproof. And as a result, many times when tigers were going extinct, they could still see the pug marks somehow in the park. And that made the estimation process more important. It triggered the scientific revolution in the population estimation of tigers and large animals in general. And that has resulted in this recovery since last 20 years now, since 2006, where we see an annual increase in the 6% increase in the tiger population. And now India supports around 3,600, which is 70% of the global wild tiger populations. Of course, I mean, that came because of a good part of tiger, which is that it has stripes, and every tiger has in unique stripe patterns. So it became very easy to put camera traps and monitor their population, monitor individual movement, and then estimate population based on many other indicators. And that reliable method helped managers to prioritize areas where they could conserve the source population or manage the dispersing individuals in multi-use areas. But this, apart from this fascinating story, for me, it is an interesting experiment to answer this question, that what shapes effective recovery of megafauna in the Anthropocene, and what are the benefits of these megafauna recovery. So apart from the recovery thing of tiger, which we'll revisit in a while, the process of tiger recovery enabled scientific assessment of larger national parks of India. And the maps that you see on your screen, the first map is of the Carnivore Science Survey, which is conducted. So around 320,000 square kilometer area is national areas are divided into grid cells of 5 by 5 kilometers. And in every such grid cell, in every forested or savanna landscape, they have this Carnivore Science Survey, line transect for assessment of herbivore densities, vegetation plots for understanding the habitat status, as well as anthropogenic pressures. And that has generated this world's largest systematic database on wildlife population, as recorded in the Guinness Book. And it also offers a good data to validate and test some interesting hypotheses for megafauna recovery. Recently, we happened to publish this work on recovery of tigers in Science this January. So the map shows all those dark maroon plots are where the tigers' source populations are. The orange areas are where they colonize in last 16 so years. We tried to understand what were the underlying factors that helped in this colonization, and what were those triggers that might have led to extinction of tigers in some parts. So what we understand, what there were in this graph, you see here at the bottom, that around 3,000 square kilometer area was colonized by tiger every year for last 2 decades. And these areas were largely in proximity of protected area with high habitat availability, prey abundance, lesser extractive pressures, and lesser habitat loss altogether. But apart from that, what a tiger needs ecologically to survive in a landscape is, of course, food, the first thing. For one tiger, I mean, this is the first graph you see here on the screen is the relationship between prey abundance and tiger densities. A tiger hunts one deer, is estimated to hunt one deer every 3 to 4 days. And that makes, we would need at least 350 prey deers for one tiger to sustain one tiger. And to make a source population, we would want 20 breeding tigresses in an area. To support those many tigresses and each requiring that many deers, we would want at least 2,000 square kilometer to establish a source population. Now, that is not a luxury that India has because it's, of course, populated and it has been anciently modified landscape. You cannot recreate these forests within decades. On an average, the protected area size is around 700 to 800 square kilometers. So rather than investing solely on the source population, what the idea was to connect multiple protected areas and generate this meta population where tigers could be shared between different smaller protected areas connected by habitat corridors and multi-use areas. And that is where it goes beyond the tiger and the deer, and it becomes about the tiger and the people. So the maps, the chronology of map here is about one tiger reserve, Corbett, which is in the Himalayan foothills. We see that in 2006, the darker green areas, which indicates tiger presence, was restricted to these protected areas, Corbett. And with time, in the next 12 years, those tigers spread across the entire landscape, utilizing corridors and neighboring protected areas. And of course, as this graph shows that as we go away from protected area or these habitat corridors, the chances of a tiger to survive in landscape decline. So protected areas and multi-use areas in between those protected areas are key for sustaining high densities and metapopulation of tigers. In this case, at least, land sparing enables land sharing. And when it comes to people and the tiger, everything, I mean, because of the diversity of communities, social diversity in this landscape, the interactions might differ. The first, when we see the tiger recovery against the population density, the graph at the bottom, we see that, of course, tigers were much more persistent in less densely populated areas, but they did colonize moderately populated, human populated areas as well. But when we see it against urbanization, that is a sharp decline. So tigers were okay with coexisting or co-occurring with humans, but not with urbanization. So which means that the nature of land use and intensification is much more a negative factor for tiger than just the number of people. And this becomes even more interesting when we include the socioeconomic spectrum of this population. So the, the bar graph here on the top right is about poverty rates and percent grids colonized and persistent. With increasing poverty, we see a sharp decline despite availability of this widespread habitat patches. If those habitat patches had poor socioeconomic communities living in between them, the chances that they would have a tiger in backyard decline severely. So to speak very plainly, tiger recovery was constrained from the opposite ends of a socioeconomic spectrum, urbanization on one hand and rural poverty on another. And why is poverty linked at such a macro scale? Why was poverty linked with this? With these extinctions or this decline in colonization is because of many reasons, but one is, of course, a socio-political conflict. In many parts of India, largely the blue hatched parts, these are suitable tiger habitats where tigers did not occur or where they went extinct. And they all coincide with extreme group, Nakshal group operating in this landscape, the extreme Maoist group, which result in this conflict between people and the state. And it also makes the access to cheap and illegal arms and ammunition very easy. The region is very poor. So there is this nexus between poverty, conflict, political conflict, and access to illegal arms. And whenever it is seen in other parts of the world that whenever poor communities have access to arms and they do not get enough food subsidies, enough opportunities to develop because of various reasons, they might still want to have some access for food, for natural resources, including natural meat, which comes from wild meat hunting. And when they put snares for wild meat, the snares do not differentiate between herbivores and carnivores, leading to extinction, leading to deaths of many tigers and leopards in the region. And these are also the hotspots where which might have potential links with international pressures for poaching tigers. So most of these conflicts have very complex socio-political and international connections underlying it. If one has to recover tiger in these 15 to 20,000 square kilometers, it is not only the ecological carrying capacity that one has to consider, but much more social political settings that have to be improved. Apart from these challenges, of course, the other regular challenges persist. Poverty is not the strongest reason for extinction of tigers or decline in their occupancy. It is also the loss of habitat due to developmental projects. It could be also roads and railways, as we show here, that with increasing infrastructural development, the chances of colonization decline. So unless one uses smart technologies to allow tigers to navigate through such landscape, it becomes very difficult for tiger to colonize a rapidly altering landscape. The pressures from mining, the pressures from other developmental activities and habitat loss also have similar restricting effect on tigers. There is more insidious threat to tiger, which is this prevalence of invasive alien plants. Nearly 66% of India is invaded by plants like Lantana camara and Prosopis juliflora, which reduces their herbivore carrying capacity, directly impacting the carnivore carrying capacity. So the challenges are multifaceted, and yet we see that fascinating recovery of tigers. And the whole premise of conserving a large predator like tiger was to see if it could be utilized as an umbrella species. The charisma of a tiger could be utilized as an umbrella species to conserve many other species. And we see this coincidence that all large animals in the landscape shared an increase in areas that had tiger occurrence, including the prey species, of course, which is a circular argument that with increasing prey, you have more tiger, and with increasing tiger, you have more protection, so more prey. So that is one. But apart from those direct benefits, we also have several co-benefits. In this graph, for an example, on x-axis, we have years, and the hashed line is about the year when the area was declared as protected area, and we see, and the trajectory is about the cumulative forest loss. And we see as soon as tiger reserves were declared as a legal entity, the forest loss declined significantly. And that was equivalent to many tons of carbon. So tiger conservation might have enabled carbon conservation in these areas. Out of these wet biomes, there were few areas which were protected for tigers, which not only increase the carbon capture potential and conservation of this old growth forest, but also enabled to utilize their biotic resistance ability to resist invasive plants. Many core regions of tiger reserves were not threatened by invasive plants, despite being surrounded by source population, very dense source population of these plants, because of the inherent ability and cumulative computation of a very rich flora there to resist invasive species. So there are various co-benefits of tiger conservation. But of course, speaking of that, one has to realize that it is not an easy path to have tigers in your backyard. The yearly livestock that are lost to tiger is between 10 to 14,000. Around 45 to 50 people are killed by tigers in the same landscape. And if you ask me if there is a community which has rallied to persecute tigers from all their backyard, there's not even one such community. And that is, for me, not just fascinating, but very inspiring to have high densities of such communities and diversities of communities, and yet linked with a common notion of living with large carnivore that might risk their lives. Of course, it should not be utilized in a misuse in a way. That's why we have amount equivalent to the livestock loss compensated by government. And in case of a person is lost, there is some ex gratia provided by private agencies as well as government agencies. And there is requirement to update these policies time to time to match with the prices. And on top of it, I think what is also acting as a very important driver of tiger recovery is tourism. Just watch this photograph. It's a cattle, right? And the tiger is killing it. It's in multi-use area, which is outside core region, and there are tourists seeing it. So the family who has lost this cattle would get, of course, compensation from government, but they would also benefit immensely from those tourists, because those tourists would come and live in mostly these multi-use areas, and the shares emerging from tourism are shared with local communities. So we might be approaching a win-win situation, but when there is loss of human lives in the whole thing, it should not be taken as win-win. There have to be more effective policies on reducing the number of human deaths, and that has been one agenda for conservation in India. And of course, when we put all the benefits together, there's this estimated 120 to 270 million US dollar per year benefits. They're just putting a price tag, but many times these tags help conservation legislation many times. Uh, so in a nutshell, I think to summarize tiger recovery story, protected area vital and for high density source population, but of course, they must be embedded in a peaceful, sustainable and prosperous surrounding. Just creating protected area alone is not helpful. Land sharing coincides with high conflict area and needs meticulous management. And culture of coexistence is strong, but it should not be always taken as granted. And because cultures tend to change very fast, we see the same communities that were hunting tigers 40 years ago have now become protector of tigers. But things might change with changing global scenarios. So in a nutshell, what we have also written in our recent paper is that the human attitude toward biodiversity, particularly large carnivores such as the tiger, is based on cultural acceptance as well as economic benefits. The latter requires meticulous governance, and the former requires conscious nurturing. I don't know if there is a indicator or an estimation to do that, but that is something that is required. But that is about tiger conservation. These conservation policies are very much tailored to every species. What works for tigers might not work for snow leopards. Now, another small case that I am presenting is about snow leopards. And this work was led by this amazing officer, Pankaj Raina, who is a forest officer, was in Ladakh during this work, and is now doing PhD on the work that I'm going to present to you. So for many people who don't know, India also has Trans-Himalaya, a part where temperature in winters might reach to -30 or -40. It is 4,000 meters and above in many areas. The oxygen levels are very low, and it supports an amazing array of uh, diverse fauna, including the snow leopard. What happens in these aerial landscape is, of course, the productive zones are restricted to these valleys around the river valleys like the Indus River Valley or lakes in that area. And historically, because these are the hotspot of productivity, they are used by local communities for multiple purposes, including livestock. And you know where I go with livestock, right? And snow leopard, the same story, but a bit different. It was interesting, apart from the conservation story, it was interesting to devise a method to assess snow leopard population. Unlike tigers, snow leopards have a very thick fur. So when you take the camera trap photographs, there's this distortion in every photograph, and it makes population assessment of snow leopard a big challenge. Till now, people have tried many indicators of circumventing that, but it was just a proxy, I think. So what we did was rather use this facial pattern where the fur thickness is very small and it is constant, it is not distorted. The only challenge was to make snow leopard bend in front of the camera trap. And how do you do that? And that is where a very interesting experiment emerged out of all the spray that we tried. Kelvin Klein was very effective in making this, and this has been observed in zoos in the US, that tiger and puma, apparently they also responded very strongly to Kelvin Klein. I'm not a brand ambassador, I'm just stating what helped us in the field. So those cats, snow leopards, also responded very interestingly to Kelvin Klein. And what we see that once we have very reliable indicator of snow leopard, their prey, their habitat and climate, which is a very integrative way of understanding snow leopard ecology and their population. We see that snow leopard population increase with increasing prey, as well as increasing livestock. And when we did some diet analysis, Pankaj, the PhD student, found that snow leopards heavily rely on livestock, particularly in summers when livestock are all around the landscape, right? And so yeah, uh, so this is the landscape. I think around 6,100 kilometers were walked by the local communities and forest guards to find all the snow leopard signs and get occupancy of around 25,000 square kilometers. And within those areas, then the camera trap subset of high density, low density, moderate density areas to find almost 27,000 images of snow leopards. And out of those, there were only 126 unique individuals as identified by their facial patterns. And when you propagate the density within the sampled area, you find nearly 460 estimated population. But of course, there are these holes where sampling could not happen because of multiple reasons. It's an international border, so the permit to access there is very difficult. So we also propagated it in those areas using Maxent suitability modeling and found around 477 individuals. So the addition was only around 17 snow leopard. So this area, particularly the Hemis, which is at center, is one of the highest densities of snow leopards in the world. And those snow leopards are equally relying on livestock. Of course, there are herbivores coexisting with mostly in valleys. If you see all those linear structures, dark blue structures, those are valleys because they are, as I said, very productive. And so in winters, what happened, we also tagged few snow leopard to see how they move across different seasons, what resources they utilize in different seasons. It was a challenging, daunting task, but thanks to Pankaj and his team, it became easy to work in that landscape. What we found was the home range was around 400 square kilometer for a snow leopard in winters, where it had to move a lot because it could not, of course, travel across the snow-clad mountains. And the livestock were all guarded, and herbivores become more widespread. So they have to move a lot in winters. And these herbivores, of course, as I said, they're highly dense in the valleys, and there is this elevational movement in winters, and which makes land sharing in these valleys inevitable. And given the utilization of domestic animals by snow leopard, conflict mitigation through timely compensation becomes a key strategy. And land sharing approaches that integrate this conflict mitigation along with the traditional practice of pastoralism and ecotourism should be harnessed for mitigating the losses, the economic losses, and for gaining the favor of these local communities by the wildlife managers, which has been experimented in this landscape. And hence, I think sustainable tourism and peaceful landscape is the key. But the interesting word of peaceful here is because many of you might know Ladakh was part of the erstwhile Jammu and Kashmir state and was reorganized as a different union territory in 2019. The recent attack in Jammu and Kashmir on tourists have could potentially in Jammu and Kashmir have reduced tourism to almost negligible extent. And this is a very adjoining area. If we put all the resources and all the benefits emerging from these conservation, ecotourism related practices, and if there is a terrorism or any such conflict, political conflict, influencing such economic model, that could devastate the whole idea and the premise of conservation. So irrespective of how many tourists are pulled for these furry cats every winter in this landscape, I think it goes beyond economics, and politics, particularly international politics, becomes much more important. And I don't have solution for that, but I know that it is very important to be addressed. So that was about the two cats, the large cats, and they're surviving in very distinct biomes. The last case is about herbivores. There are four megaherbivores in India: elephant, gaur, the wild buffalo, and the one-horned rhino, the Indian rhinoceros. And it's interesting that they continue to exist in India despite such a high population. It never fails to fascinate that how could these animals live in such a tightly packed and altered landscape. But we see, so in these graphs, on these maps, all these emojis, the icons, they represent the total range that currently exists for these mega herbivores. And the dark orange is the percent of those ranges occupied. You see that only around 50% of the range is occupied by Asian elephant. And when we talk about wild buffalo, it is less than 10%, of course. And now wild buffalo is restricted to this very floodplain, savanna, wet, uh, swampy areas. It has even altered the ideas of ecologists who think that this wild buffalo is something, a species which can only occur in wet and swampy areas, which is not the case. We know that this wild buffalo species was widespread across central parts of central India till very recent, just 20 years ago. But extinctions can really erode knowledge about the species and nature. Of course, the graph that I have put here is the long-term change in population of elephants. It was led by Khan and Uma from NCBS and many other agencies, I think. And they put this estimation, the population across Holocene, or at least parts of Holocene, and they see this sudden decline in 1500 years ago, and then recovery of elephants in recent, which is interesting to me, given that so many areas are still left to occupy by elephants, and there is potential that they might grow. But of course, elephants co-occur with 40 million people today, and that has many other challenges. But an interesting pattern for all biogeographers here. So this graph, the bottom is in middle is about mean annual rainfall and the biomass of megaherbivores on y-axis. In terms of in case of okay, so in case of Africa, we have megaherbivores more skewed towards the drier parts, but because in India, savannas were considered as wasteland for a very long time, we had only forested areas protected, and that has resulted in this skew of megaherbivores occurring wetter biomes. And maybe in future, if there is any potential to recover, it should be in the drier biomes. But that said, these graphs, they are base data published by Pandey and colleagues in last year, where they show that there are at least 5 million USD lost every year because of the elephant-related conflict by the people. And many people lose their life on an annual basis, of course, because of conflict with the elephant. Not just people, elephants are also killed, but the proportion is very less. The death by electrocution, for an example, the electrocution is used for protecting their farms many times, and it kills around 60 elephant every year. There is retaliatory poisoning for which kills around 6 elephants every year, and train collusion, which is a rising cause of elephant mortality. It also kills a few elephants every year. So we have a very dynamic landscape where it is about life of both the megaherbivores and people. And yet there is this underlying very strong cultural reverence for megafauna in this, and they do occur and they are increasing in number. So beyond this all potential of number game and occurrence and co-occurrence of people and of megafauna, one of the questions was that are these megafauna species relevant in the Anthropocene setting? We know that once upon a time they regulated vegetation, but now vegetation's communities have changed. As I said, that 66% natural areas in India are invaded by new species that were not there previously, right? And they're creating novel ecosystems, they're disrupting fire regimes, land use has rapidly changed. So will they execute the same role that these megafauna did play in once upon a time? So my question here was do megaherbivores still have a key role in regulating vegetation dynamics? And what is their role in regulating the seemingly novel ecosystems of the Anthropocene? And we utilize the same data in an experimental fashion, where we saw that areas with high densities of megaherbivores, moderate and low densities, and with no megaherbivores, how they change in terms of composition of native plants and invasive plants. And what we see is that with increasing megaherbivore density, there's a sharp decline in invasive plant cover. And there's an increase in native plant cover and richness as well. And there is decline in the richness of alien plants in general. So we have a system where megaherbivores have potentially reduced invasions and promoted native plants. And that in turn offers more forage for more megaherbivores, increasing the carrying capacity of these areas for more megaherbivores, thus creating this seemingly positive feedback, positive in sense of ecological desirability. And in absence of megaherbivores, what we see is there's no regulatory force for many invasive plants, which further cumulatively decline, because competitively decline native plants, which further limit the recovery potential of megaherbivores. So we have this very opposite feedbacks happening in presence and absence of megaherbivore. And that means even in seemingly novel ecosystems, megaherbivores could have a central role to play and their recovery. Of course, it should not be taken at the face value. There are other nuances. For an example, we know that megaherbivores could not regulate shrubby and woody area, which were neither accessible or was physically possible to take down the high abundances of such shrubby plants. But they were very effective when it came to herbaceous plants. And they were more effective in open and semi-open landscape, which is a very natural habitat for megaherbivores than what they were in wet ecosystems or forested ecosystems. And why do these megaherbivores would have such a decline? Why would they reduce invasive plants? One is because via consumptions, they are okay with consuming diverse spectrum of forage nutrition, and they consume a lot, of course. And they not only consume invasive plants, they make this periodic opening for native plants to propagate, which are potentially evolved to with herbivory pressure, and they also disperse many native plants. So cumulatively, they might be reducing invasive plants and helping native plants to recover. And this potential, this role has been utilized by local managers and states in India to recover the species that went extinct 20, 30 years ago. Wild buffalo that went extinct from Kanha Tiger Reserve in central India is one such reserve who is considering to bring back wild buffalo to utilize the potential benefits of it. Now, what we did further was we projected these benefits across global ecosystems. And we see that using a meta-analysis, we see a close parity between the relationship that we got and what exists in other landscapes, such as the sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Southeast Asia, that megaherbivores did reduce invasive plants. So there's a great potential out there to use megaherbivores, to rewild megaherbivores and restore them, to potentially resolve the emerging question and problem of invasive plant dominance. And that becomes more important because we know the densities, even where megaherbivores exist today, the populations have been depauperate and extinct from many areas, and rewilding them to their whatever socioecologically plausible carrying capacity could be a nature-based solution for sustainable and resilient ecosystems. So in a nutshell, this question that I pose in front, the beginning, that what are the overarching factors shaping megafauna sustenance in the Anthropocene? When we see it from a global perspective, we know, of course, this paper where they see interesting maps here. This is megaherbivore against socioeconomic indicators like governance index, conservation funding, human development index. In many of such indices, India is not doing fairly great, right? Despite that, the recovery of megafauna in such landscape is, of course, fascinating, but also challenging. That to what level will people tolerate this, and what will be that threshold after which people might not? And if there is such a threshold, because of course there's this obsession of getting one social carrying capacity for all animals in landscape, which is not ecologically or sociologically feasible. So going beyond such number and thresholds, what I think in my last slide is also very important. And I could not somehow get it scientifically or mechanistically proven, but it emerged as the most important parameter determining megafauna co-occurrence in Anthropocene, despite bad governance indicators or human development indices, was the culture of coexistence. Now, megafauna in has been a culture have been cultural icons amongst all Indian religions. The first image that you see is what we call it now a Pashupati. We don't know but it's a Indus Valley seal here, of course. The deity or the person in between is surrounded by many wild animals, including tiger, elephant, rhino, and buffalo. The place where it was found is along the Indus, where none of these species exist. But we know that once upon a time it was revered, might have been revered. And the use of these icons into everyday culture has become very prevalent across the emergence of cultures, be it Buddhism, Jainism, or even the modern depiction of Mother India. They continue depicting, associating large animals with uh, these icons. Beyond such religious icon, there's also in social integration. Megafauna as a species are integral part of many art forms, poetry, literature, dance forms like the Holi dance here, which is in parts of Western Ghats, and many other art forms. So this cultural value and the newly added legislation of megafauna conservation provides a moral framework in which removing megafauna has become a deterrent, a moral deterrent in minds of many communities, which was always part of it. But now why it has become more accepted in these communities and why it has become likely effective is because of the economic undercurrents, the benefits that ecotourism might bring tomorrow based on what you invest today, and how it might help to come out of poverty trap very soon in these areas which have been for a very long time neglected, has helped these communities to see potential beyond culture, a potential in these megafauna recovery. But that's my inference. We need more work, more social, political, cultural work on these aspects in India, which is not very something that happens in Indian academia now. So in a nutshell, diversity of association is the key term that helps megafauna conservation. If today megafauna, I mean, tigers go extinct and they go extinct from the memories of people in one particular area, maybe in the next 40 years, another association in terms of poetry, in terms of art form, in terms of potential economic package that it brings. So if one association, one part of memory goes away, do we have another association or memory to fill in that space? And the diversity of such associations enables the sustenance and recovery of megafauna in this landscape. And because of its diverse background and overall ethos, it has become very easy to have these plural and diverse and very vibrant ideas together. Wherever, if one idea goes away or goes extinct, there's another idea of co-occurrence and coexistence that emerges and helps people and animals live together. So that's all from me. I look forward for your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, terrific. A fascinating story and amazing data as well, the richness of the analysis. So we can open up to questions now. Does somebody want to hit the lights? Is that something it is? Just to get a brighter again. And all right, I'll just kick off by on the data side. It sounds like the data collection was initiated in the 1970s with this Project Tiger. And so what led to such a large and coherent data set being connected and maintained and not falling apart and changes of government and things like that? What do you think were the factors that supported that?
Yeah, you're right. The Project Tiger started in 1970s, and the then method of estimating tiger population was based on pug marks. But we did see that it did not work well in many parts because it becomes very art driven of identifying individuals based on pug marks. So there was this, with modern science and wildlife conservation investments, And easy access to technology, use of camera traps became much more accessible and much more reliable, robust way of monitoring population. And there was extinction in 2004, in early 2000s in Sariska and Panna that triggered this public outrage, and government was pressurized to an extent that they had to devise a very effective, robust way of, and of course there was willingness in government since always. It has been a common criteria irrespective of which party is in the government. They have always taken pride in conserving the national animal. That is by default, because they, of course, they mirror what the sentiments in society. They have to have this strong support for wildlife, and that both, I mean, the scientific improvements and this political pressure following extinctions, they converged well to come up with this national assessment where they have to monitor populations across the country every 4 years since 2006. And that has been a very reliable indicator of recovery.
Great, thank you. Yeah, put up.
Thanks very much. There's so many questions I have. Is this on? Yeah, good, good. I'm so excited by having evidence to show that megafauna do actually stop invasive species. How did you control? So all else being equal, we see more megafauna in natural parks, and all else being equal, we see fewer invasive species in natural parks. How did you untangle that causal effect that it's the megafauna and not the protected status?
Yes, it was based on many other cases. There have been these exclusion experiments across smaller parks in both in Nepal and parts of India, where they saw that once they exclude megaherbivores in an area where they're present in high density, as soon as they remove this very hyper-dominant species, both native and invasive, they proliferate. So we use those ideas to see that which were those species which were likely to be more dominant once we remove megaherbivores, and merely did this correlation at macro scale. So it was upscaling those small experiments to bigger levels.
Thank you. What a way to finish the week. What an outstanding presentation. Thank you so much for that. You presented a paper by Jens Svenning's group showcasing the fact that by socioeconomic status, by governance, and by something else, I forgot the third one, India is a little bit of an outlier in terms of the relationships between protection for megafauna. Are there other countries in the world that are also an outlier? And is there a sense of whether we can attribute that outlierness to their sense of historical connection to animals, as you have put forward?
So if I correctly understand what you were asking, that in this paper, they show that there are many social indicators that why megafauna should not exist, and despite that it exists in India. And if there are some key processes that could be upscaled.
I suppose so. Yeah, related to that. So India is a little, if I understood it correctly, India seems to be a bit of an outlier in terms of the protection towards megafauna. By all those indexes, India should not be doing as relatively well, right? And if I understood it correctly, towards the end of your presentation, I think that your thesis was that it shouldn't be surprising because it has such a heritage, such a connection to fauna for such a long time. So then if we flip it back to that map, are there other outliers? And could one apply your thesis there, that those outliers are also outliers because the connection to animals?
Yes, the answer is yes to that. And the title of that paper is very, very interesting, rather. If you see, it was not about getting this pattern, but saying that using recent baseline as benchmark for megafauna restoration places an unfair burden on the global south. There are two things here. It says that despite not so good social scenarios, megafauna exist in many such areas, not just India, but also many areas. And then we have many areas where they did historically exist, and there's better governance, more space, and more conservation funding as well. And despite that, there's so less recovery that we have seen in these areas. And that is why I connected that what might be missing in such areas is the not the global south, the global north, or many parts of other global south, like the neotropics, is the idea of associating with megafauna in their backyard. And that comes in various ways, not just ecologically or in real life, but in terms of culture as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that continuing on what you just said in the last point of your talk, I'm very interested in the kind of cultural representation as a way to kind of sway popular ideas about ecology and conservation and such. Have you heard of people using data such as camera traps in the kind of work of basically like using or getting the conservation more into the minds of the public and using specifically this data as a way to do that, as in publishing camera trap photos or using them in some sort of way that is public?
That's the idea.
Okay.
Yes, that's the idea, that all evidence emerging scientifically should inspire people. I mean, it's for people, it's not for random set of policymakers to make decisions on behalf of people. People should see this evidence and connect with it to see what it means and how well it can be used.
Have you seen that happening at all, or?
I don't have an answer for that,
Okay.
because I'll have to go and check with people if they feel that. What we know is that for sure, wherever tigers have increased, it is because scientific evidence was used, camera trapping based population monitoring, and all such areas, including very posh top safari parks in India. The people, not everyone, but many people are very happy with the recovery that they see. And they understand that because tiger photographs every year are published as an album, that what are the newcomers to this park, and how people they purchase those albums to keep a record of which animal would be sighted where. Not everywhere, but I've seen that happening in Kanha, for example, in central India. So there are different ways in which people are associating with this, and it would be an interesting thing to go and see this association. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Gotta go way back.
Okay. Yeah, great talk. Thank you. I wondered, so the economic benefits that you get from the ecotourism, would it work still, because India is still such an outlier and it still has many megafauna? People, presumably a lot of the economic benefits come from international tourists. So if we were able to switch things around and increase our connection with nature worldwide, in terms of culturally, would you still see, would it be sustainable to have to see these economic benefits? Yeah, is it possible?
Yes, the association should not be merely tourism driven. The benefit, if I correctly understand you, what I'd say is that, as I said in the example of snow leopard, that if tourism industry could be collapsed because of the eventual, the tourism, the terrorism threat, cross-border terrorism, of course, it becomes very difficult that if we put all our efforts in enhancing tourism-based conservation, right? When such models collapse, there have to be an alternative use of other methods to keep that association between people and wildlife. Culture is one part. There might be many other ways of connecting, like camera trapping, relating with animals by those communities could be one way of doing it. Yeah.
That was really fascinating. I'm doing some work on the wildlife economy in Southern and East Africa, where there are still megafauna. And there's a sustainable use model there. I'm interested in what the kind of sentiment is towards sustainable use on the subcontinent. And also whether, this is a strange question, whether whether the fact that most of India is vegetarian has an effect on prevalence of megafauna, and particularly, I suppose, prey species when it comes to carnivore. So there is that available because it's not being hunted by people who might be in poverty and want to eat that, there'd be competition for that food.
Thank you. Yes and no. I mean, for most of, by sustainable use, you mean harvesting animals,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So this is a landscape of prophecies. The answers that I'm going to give, it emerged from people because no one has really worked experimentally on trying to understand either people or the recovery potential of animals. Unlike Africa, it has not happened in India. Wherever there is hunting in India, harvest, the wildlife population is depauperate. So there are few individuals who think that hunting should be legalized in India, but people do not support that at the moment. There are a few communities who might support if it comes as a law, but how will that have this cascading impacts, ripples on all the existing association is something that we don't know. The moral framework, the moral plus legal framework of thinking hunting wild animal as something immoral would be surely dismantled. So we don't know if it is going to be a very useful way. But that is about tigers. But there are many other species which might be abundant in multi-use areas, like wild pigs, for example, which are not hunted, but one can get a permit if one proves that it is a conflict species to harvest wild pigs. If there is no yes and no to that, but if people check it experimentally, using social experiment, I mean, to see if people are okay with hunting regimes, only then we would know if it could be upscaled or not. And about the second part of question where vegetarianism, association of vegetarianism and coexistence, it is interesting because India is one of the country in the world which has highest proportion of vegetarians, but majority of Indians are mixed feeders, as we say in ecology. They eat both. But of course, when you see it from the global perspective, the proportion of vegetarians is very high. And interestingly, the vegetarian communities it is a privilege. It comes with alternatives available for eating plant-based protein sources and good fibers and many other nutrients, not available for many marginalized communities and poverty-ridden areas, right? And those people, irrespective of community, they might rely on wild sources of proteins. So hunting is the last option many of these communities use. It is not a game for them. It is just mere survival where it is.
I'm curious about this question about whether, given the general lower prevalence of eating meat, but of the higher herbivore populations enables tiger population to be sustained, which would not be possible in a landscape with more bushmeat hunting, for example.
I agree. I mean, Jens and I were talking about the same thing, about comparing the European scenario and the South Asian ones. And I think the idea of many people who eat meat in India many times do not agree to it publicly because it's seen something as not acceptable culturally. Not everywhere, but in many cases, in many parts. And this might have helped to stop, to draw a line on hunting pressures, in particularly in the drier area, where across the world we see desert-like conditions. People are heavily communities rely on wild meat because nothing else grows. But one of the most strict vegetarian communities and religions like Jainism has emerged in a very arid system in India, and which is a strong proponent of vegetarianism, which might have helped in these deserts being very biodiverse even today. Yeah. But that pressure of vegetarian demands could be compared with the pressure that happens for palm oil, demand, which destroys wildlife elsewhere. India is world's highest consumer of palm oil, just due to the sheer number of people. Even if their per capita consumption is low, in the abundance, it is very high. And that vegetarian diet has a footprint somewhere else, right? So it comes at a cost, I think. But It's interesting.
Thank you. That was an amazing talk, and I especially loved the last slide because I do feel that India's culture really like holds and transmits knowledge on biodiversity. But my question was also like on the ground, often you find, like recently I read this article about how 5.5 lakh tribal communities have been displaced because of the establishment of tiger reserves. And of course, we know that these kind of compensatory housing and alternate livelihoods have not been executed properly. So there is this story and like this kind of sentiment that if you're a conservation person, then you're anti-people. I've definitely heard that in the field, especially in and around protected areas. So how do you kind of reconcile the increase in tigers along with this increase in wildlife and human conflict, and kind of like if we had done this differently, how would we have done it differently? Do you have thoughts on that? Yeah.
Interesting question. I agree with whatever the questions that you say. They're more important, I think. So this is a slide I put for just reference here. So the central image is a part that was a community, a local community, which was in maybe 20 years ago, relocated outside a core region, and they were given this housing place, some lucrative options for sustenance and whatever jobs, and the area meanwhile recovered its habitat. So this is one way that the ideal way it should have happened. But before 20 years, before the whole Project Tiger was refurnished into a much more equitable package, it was not a prevalent practice. So many communities that were displaced and relocated before that might not have all got this compensation. And it is important. So the clear message from the tiger recovery is that if people are happy, tigers are happy. If people are not happy, tigers are not. If there are unhappy people living with tigers, those tigers are not very sustainable in that landscape. But we see tigers very thriving in landscape because people are not that unhappy. There are many communities who are expressing their anger over the historical wrong that might have committed a few decades ago. And I think increasing transparency in these political decisions, which has happened in recent years a lot, should be extended to these communities somehow. If that works, if they are, if they agree, it should be based on what they think. And all these processes now a voluntary process, right? You have to have every person voluntarily say that I want to go out if there is an alternative. If you provide me such an economic compensation, and they give you really good package for every person. So, but the spirit of voluntary relocation should be there. It should not be only in documents. I agree with you, and I think only transparency could enhance that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, and the sort of apparently low levels of conflict are really fascinating. I work with bears or indirectly with bears in the Andes, and the ecotourism thing is a big problem in Ecuador, for example. That rising political problems mean that ecotourism has just flatlined and dropped off, and then the conflict with bears has escalated at the same time. And part of that was because when they stopped hunting, they banned hunting like with tigers in the 90s, I think, and the bear population escalated very quickly, and it was great ecotourism, and then suddenly the habitat hasn't increased, right? So I wondered to what extent, and so now there's an increasing conflict and ecotourism dropped off at the same time, and that means that hunting has really started again. And there's also a lot of distrust with conservationists because everybody said bears don't eat cattle, you're imagining it's puma. And then bears do eat cattle, and the villagers were right. And I wondered to what extent there's a risk of the buffers being hit in India, of the urbanization's increasing. This early slide you showed, the landscape is what do we know how close we are to maximum populations of these animals, and what might happen if that if that sort of
reached.
if that's reached, yeah.
Yeah, we don't know what would happen, but global cases like here say that there's this building tension between people, both conservationists, because of course they see the tension building on ground, right? And we don't know solutions. Solutions are better if they emerge from ground and not in a retaliatory spirit, but in a creative spirit. If there is a requirement of sustainable use, it